Do you feel tired, hungry, and chained to your medications? If you do, it's not because you're weak, it's because your body has been using the wrong fuel for its main energy source. So, today, I want to show you how changing from sugar burning over to fat burning can change everything from your waistline down to your lab work. And this all comes down to, like I said, the answer to the question, can you lose fat when you exercise, all depends on what is your main energy source. So, what I mean by that is your body has two different sources that it can use for its energy. An energy that the body uses called ATP. Your body can use glucose to make ATP, and it can also use fat to make ATP. So, just so you understand, glucose is the basic building block of all carbohydrates, and carbohydrates means all plant-based foods and also all man-made food. But I think you follow me enough to know that man-made food, everything in a box, bottle, bag, and can that has a list of ingredients of all the glucose, fructose, seed oils, and chemicals that it has in it, that's never a choice. That's what's causing all the disease and everything that we see today. It's using man-made food. So, leaving man-made food out of this, let's just talk about even God-made food. God-made food means real fruit, real vegetables, and real meat. But remember, fruits and vegetables also come from plants, and all plants have glucose. Some has more than others. So, like the plants that grow below the ground, like potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, those things, they tend to have a lot of glucose because that's the storage form of energy for the plant. The plants that grow above the ground, your lettuce, tomatoes, pickles, that stuff doesn't have a whole lot of glucose. So that's usually fine. So those are the two sources. You have carbohydrates, which is glucose, and you have fat. Now, just so you know, carbohydrates, if you're using glucose for your energy source, you only get about 4 calories for 1 gram of glucose. Okay, so 4 calories. If you are using fat, fat has 9 calories for 1 gram of fat. So for this exact same amount and volume of 1 gram, you're getting over twice the amount of energy of ATP with fat than you do carbohydrates. So that's one thing to let you know. Fat is a much better energy source for our bodies, but it gets even more than that. So basically, and I want you to understand this as I go through this, when you use glucose, carbohydrates for your main energy source, the path that takes leads you to disease, to medications, to organ damage, and eventually to death. However, when you use fat for your energy source, it does the exact opposite. This leads to weight loss, your health improves, and your quality of life drastically improves. Now, the problem with this is we've been told from the food companies ever since 1977 that we're supposed to use carbohydrates for our energy source. And since that's happened, you can look around and see all the diseases, all the fatty liver disease, the type 2 diabetes, the fatty pancreas, fatty liver, fatty kidneys, fatty brain, all the diseases that we're seeing now. These are basically brand new diseases that we just saw since our dietary guidelines changed in 77. So back when I was a child, we never had any of these diseases. So that also proves that we are never supposed to use glucose for our main energy source. So we talked about the energy. So fat has 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrates or glucose has 4 calories per gram. Now let's look at storage. When you have storage, our glucose stores, if you take all the glucose that we store in our body, all there is about 10% of our liver. So that's about 100 grams. So it's only about 400 calories. And then 1% of each of our skeletal muscles also uses stored glucose. And stored glucose is called glycogen. Glycogen is like little glucose bricks. So our liver has about 100 grams. That's 400 calories. Our muscles have about 500 grams, which is around 2,000 calories. But with our muscle cells, each glycogen in each of these muscle cells is only good for that one muscle cell. So that glycogen is there just for that muscle. But if you take all together, and then if you take all the glucose out of our blood, just take all the glucose out of your blood at one time, it only comes about 2 teaspoons of glucose. It's about 4 grams. So what I'm saying with this is when you look at our glucose stores, every single bit of glucose stores in our bodies, it only comes about 2,400 calories. That's enough calories to last about 24 hours while you're sleeping without doing any activity whatsoever. Okay. So that is another reason to let you know we were never supposed to use glucose for our main energy source. And most people out there, most people listening to this are using glucose for your main energy source. And as I go through this, you'll understand why I know that. But now let's switch over to fat cells. We have fat cells all over our body. Okay. It's not just a little bit of our liver. We have fat cells. Our subcutaneous fat cells are all over our body. 1 pound of fat has 4,000 calories in it. So remember, if you take all the glucose we have stored, it only comes about 2,400 calories. But when you just take 1 pound of fat, that's 4,000 calories. So if you're 10 pounds overweight, that means you've got 40,000 excess calories on your body. So again, this lets you know that we were never supposed to use glucose, that fat is our preferred energy source. Because when God made us, he knew that we were going to do a lot more than just sleep for 24 hours a day. And then you have to get up to eat so you can restore your glucose stores. He knew that there are going to be days that we may go without being able to find anything to eat. So we need plenty of energy stored on our body, and that's the way he made us. So the question is, how do you know? What controls whether you use glucose for your main energy source or whether you use fat for your main energy source? And what controls that is insulin. I can sum up all your health, the answer to high quality health, in one sentence: keep your insulin levels low. And you'll understand that through this. And I will be getting around to also whether you can burn fat when you exercise or not. So first, when your insulin levels are high, it does two things. It pushes glucose into your muscles, but it also pushes fat into your fat cells. You cannot burn your own fat when your insulin levels are high. So that's important. When your insulin levels are high, you force your body to use glucose for your energy source. When you let your insulin levels come down low, now what happens is you burn the fat out of your fat cells. And when your insulin levels are low, you push fat into your muscle cells so they can use that for energy. So now you're pushing fat in there that has 9 calories per gram, so you can get a lot more energy for a lot less volume. And you're burning the fat out of your fat cells while you're doing this, while you keep your insulin levels low. So basically, when you use glucose for an energy source, all you're doing is glucose. And then when your energy runs out, you have to eat more glucose. But when you use fat for your energy source, you burn the fat out of your fat cells, push it into your muscle cells. So you just become a revolving door of fat burning. So that really gets your fat going down quickly. What happens when you eat glucose? This is what causes your insulin to be high. Okay. So high insulin does 3 things. You eat glucose. First thing what your insulin does is, because that's what makes your insulin go high, is when you eat glucose. When you eat fat, you keep your insulin levels low. When you eat glucose, you make your insulin levels go high. When your insulin levels are high, it does 3 things. First, it pushes whatever glucose you just ate, it pushes it into your muscles so you can use that for immediate energy if you are exercising after you eat or while you're eating. So you're constantly having to replenish those glucose stores. Okay, but most people don't even do that. Most people, they just eat and then they sit and watch television, or eat or sit at their computer, or eat or sit at work. They're eating and they're not burning off any glucose. So that glucose usually doesn't have to be pushed into your muscle cells. The next thing it does is goes and it starts refilling all your glucose stores. Now, remember, that's only about 100 grams, 400 calories in your liver, and then you have about 2,000 calories or 500 grams in your muscles. So you start replenishing your glucose stores. Once you replenish your glucose stores and you use it for whatever energy, all the rest of the insulin pushes all your glucose to the liver and causes your liver to turn all that glucose into triglycerides. Okay, that's a form of fat that your body uses to transport fat around your body to all the places that it's needed. And it also tells it to store that in the fat cells. That's all you can do, is store the fat in your fat cells when your insulin levels are high. So you eat glucose, insulin levels go high. First, you push glucose in the muscle for immediate insulin energy. Then you refill your glycogen stores if they need refilled. And then the third is they turn all the rest of it into fat in form of triglycerides, and they store that in your fat cells. Okay. So what determines whether you use insulin, whether your insulin levels are high or whether it's low? And that's, like I just said, it all is determined by what you eat. When you eat glucose, your insulin goes high. When your insulin goes high, it does everything we just talked about. It's using your glucose for your energy source, and it's also storing fat in your fat cells. Okay. And then when you eat fat, that causes your insulin levels to stay low. So that's the key. What you want to do is eat the fat, keep your insulin levels low, so you burn the fat out of your fat cells and push it into your muscles for the energy source. Okay, that is key. And just remember, any food that you eat that does not come from an animal has glucose in it, just different amounts. So that's where we need you to be thinking about when you eat, and definitely stay away from all the man-made, the pastas, the breads, all the other horrible stuff that people eat. I want to take a second here. Now, if you're sitting there and you're on 2, 3, 4 medications, and every single checkup ends with a new prescription, I need you to know that this is not the only road available to you. There are other options. Now, I spent 35 years as a doctor of pharmacy, watching people get more and more medicated without getting better. And the cause was almost always started in the kitchen. And more specifically, starts right in the pantry in your kitchen. So this is why we decided, as a first step, we decided to come up with what we call the Pantry Purge Party, where we can help people purge their cabinets of all these toxins, and we'll all do it together on a live Zoom call, so we can show you exactly what ingredients are in your containers that are toxic to your body and keeping you on medications. And once you know that, then you can decide whether you want to keep it, eat it, throw it away, whatever you want to do with it. But that's the first real step, is we've got to purge your pantry of all these toxins. So if you'd like to join us for a Pantry Purge Party, and where we all do this together on a live Zoom call, all you got to do is click Pantry Purge Party below, and in a live Zoom room, we will all purge our pantries together, and we'll learn more stuff that we'll remember for the rest of our lives, that hopefully this is going to get us to switch our path from a path of sickness over to a path of being healed. You can go to drstevehewlett.com. That's our website. And there's a place for Pantry Purge Party on there also. And just click that and get on our calendar. First, we have to think about, how does our body use fuel? Our body is going to use fuel in the most efficient way it can. So the way it does that is, first, it used all the fuel that's in our bodies first, and in our blood first, and then it goes to our stored fuel. And it also does not want a high blood glucose. Our body does not like a high glucose. So it'll do everything it can to get that glucose down. Because glucose, when your glucose is high, it binds to all the proteins in your body. And our body is made of proteins. Everything you feel, our skin, our muscles, our organs, our bones, our enzymes, everything. Our body is almost all protein. When your glucose levels are high, it binds to those proteins and it degenerates it. It tears it up. It's called glycation. And our body knows this, so it wants to keep our glucose levels very low. So what happens is, first it's going to eat the glucose out of our blood first, because it wants to get that down. But then it's going to go and it's going to use the fat in our blood for its energy source. After that, it's going to go to our stored. So first it's going to use your stored glucose, and then it's going to use your stored fat. Okay. You got that. That's very important. So blood glucose first, blood fat second, then your stored glucose, then your stored fat. So do you lose fat when you exercise? That's the whole key. That's the whole title of this. When you do a very heavy resistance training, you're lifting heavy weights hard for about an hour, the most you're going to eat up is about 400 to 800 calories. Okay. That's all you're really going to use. Now, remember, glucose, you have your storage. So again, but when you take all the stores out of your blood, glucose stores, it only comes about 2,400 calories. But that is enough to get you through this exercise. And all you're going to be using is your glucose that's already available in blood, and then the glucose that you have stored. Okay. But you will never, ever get to your fat source when you are a carbohydrate burner, when you use glucose for your energy source. However, if you use fat for your energy source, so you're living a keto or low carb or carnivore type diet, and that keeps your glucose, your carbohydrates low, and so you're using fat for energy source, now you have almost an infinite source of energy available. Because again, we have fat stores all over our bodies, and our fat stores have been storing all this fat for our entire lives. However, what you're supposed to do when you keep your insulin levels low is you eat, your insulin levels go high, you store fat, then you stop eating, and then your insulin levels go low and you burn your fat. If you are a fat burner, if you are using your fat, that means your insulin levels are low. So you burn fat out of your fat cells, push those into your muscles. This is like supercharging your fat burning. So if you're a glucose burner for energy source, you will never get to your fat stores. If you use fat for your main energy source, so your insulin levels are always low, you are supercharging and you're going to be able to lose a lot of fat when you exercise. So that's why it all depends on which source you use. So how does the energy source affect your organs? First, what happens when you eat glucose for your energy source? This is what happens. You eat glucose, which means you eat carbohydrates, you eat or man-made food. But again, we're staying away from man-made food. That stuff's toxic. So you eat glucose. That makes your insulin levels go high. When your insulin levels go high, it forces your liver to turn all that excess glucose, and the minimum daily requirement of glucose, the least amount of glucose that you have to have every single day is 0. You never, ever have to eat carbohydrates. You never have to eat glucose. Your body can make all the glucose it needs out of fat and out of protein. So you never have to eat it. So when you eat glucose, your insulin levels go high. It turns all the excess glucose, which basically means all the glucose you're eating, into triglycerides in the liver. Insulin forces the liver to turn that into triglycerides. And then again, insulin forces your body to store those triglycerides in your fat cells. So it's fat storage. When those fat cells get full, that's called insulin resistance. When one fat cell is full, that cell is insulin resistant. As you start filling up all your fat cells, your body becomes more and more insulin resistant. When you have all your fat cells stuffed, no matter how much insulin you produce, you can't put any more in there. It starts storing all around your organs. This way, fat builds up for 10, 20, 30 years. So prediabetes that's happened for 10, 20, 30 years before you ever see a high blood glucose. It is not an A1C of 5.7 to 6.4. That's marketing technique from drug companies to try to get more people on diabetic medications. So when your insulin levels are high, glucose is normal. That's prediabetes. So that's what happens. When you eat glucose, you're basically causing so much fat to be stored, it starts storing around your organs, and that's when you end up with all the diseases like we talked about: fatty liver, fatty heart, fatty pancreas, fatty kidney, fatty brain, everything, because we're storing fat everywhere because we keep eating glucose. Now, when you eat fat and glucose together, so fat and carbs together, which you never see in real life. In nature, you are never going to see carbohydrates and fat together. That is so rare. You're in plants and in animals, they both have protein. Animals have way, way more protein than plants do for volume, but they still have protein. However, when it comes to the energy source, plants use glucose and animals use fat. So you have the fruits and vegetables, those are made up of protein and glucose. And then your animals, they use protein and fat. Those are the two ways that you see it. You never see fat and glucose together, except in man-made food. With all your hamburgers with a bun, with all your pizzas with a crust, all your Mexican with the shells, all these things, you're putting a protein, a glucose or carbohydrate along with a fat. And that is still not good, because once you eat that carbohydrate, now your insulin levels are high. Once your insulin levels are high, that changes what that fat that you just ate, it changes what it does. Because now what it does is, since your insulin levels are high, it's forcing all that fat that you just ate, that's forcing that into your fat cells also. So when you eat carbohydrates and fat together, like having carbohydrates with your meal, what you're actually doing is you're causing your body to store even more fat. It's almost like supercharged it. However, when you don't eat glucose at all and all you use is protein and fat, and you use fat for your energy source, now your insulin levels stay low. So now when you eat all the food, even the fat that you ate, your insulin levels are low. So that fat is actually being pushed into your muscles for energy, and it's also going around your body and used for all the other things. Glucose is only used for energy. That's it. And it's supposed to be your fight or flight energy. That's why there's such small amounts. To where fat's supposed to be your normal everyday energy. And that's why you want to use that. So when your insulin stays low, you can use fat for your energy, but fat also cushions all the organs in your body. It cushions the joints of your body. It allows you to absorb your vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K. It also every single cell in your body is made has a fatty membrane around it, and that's why we need to eat so much fat, because we're making new cells all the time. So we need that fat. We need the fat for healing. We need fat for so many things in our body. The only reason we were ever told that we had to eat no fat, low fat, and quit eating cholesterol, that's all marketing schemes from the food companies. That has nothing to do with our health. In fact, it does. When you eat that way, you're making yourself extremely sick and diseased and medicated. So that's why we realize that is marketing schemes. That has nothing to do with our health. Food companies are here for a profit. They are trying to make increased profits for their shareholders. They do not care about your health. So the whole key, when you keep your insulin level low, you burn the fat out of your fat cells and you push it into your muscles. So the whole key to the whole question is, do you lose fat when exercising? That depends. If you're a glucose burner and you're always eating you're carb loading, even like when you run, think of people who run marathons. People who run marathons are sitting there and they're running all this time. And all along, most of them are glucose burners. So they eat a ton of glucose called carb loading before the run. So they have all this glucose in their body. Then they start running and it starts pushing their muscles. And as it pushes the muscles, the glucose levels go down. And you don't have a lot of glucose stores. So these marathon runners, they're sitting there and they're having to drink glucose all along the race. Okay. Because you don't have a lot of glucose stores. So when your glucose goes low, all you can do is eat more. And usually when you eat more, people tend to eat this horrible stuff that man makes. When you use fat for your energy source, it's exact opposite. These people who use fat for their energy source, they've got fat on the body. So as they're running, they're just burning the fat out of their fat cells for their energy, and they have plenty of fat on there. Even if you're lean, you've got plenty of fat. So they're burning that, and that's going into the muscles. So they don't need to keep drinking glucose. They don't need all this energy all throughout. They already have the fat on their body. And that's the way you are when you work out. If your insulin levels are low because you're not eating carbohydrates, you will burn the fat out of your body. So do you lose fat when exercising? If you're a glucose burner, no, you do not. If you're a fat burner, you sure do. And the more you exercise, the more fat you're going to lose. So you can really supercharge your fat loss. But first, you have to teach your body to use fat for its energy instead of glucose. And all that means is quit eating the carbohydrates, or eat very small amounts, less than 50 grams. Some people eat less than 20 grams of carbs a day. But if you can eat less than 50 grams of carbs a day, then that's going to help keep your insulin levels low. When your insulin levels low, you're going to burn your fat. If you exercise, you're going to burn even more fat, and that's going to be putting that into your muscles. So that's the key. Like I said from the very beginning, the key to health is keeping your insulin levels low, which means keep glucose out of your mouth, which means keep your carbohydrate intake very low, less than 50 grams if you can. And if you can do time restricted eating or intermittent fasting, where you eat all your meals within a 6 to 8 hour period, if you can do that and leave all the rest of that time where you're not eating, so your insulin levels get to come all the way down, that will supercharge it even more. So that's the answer to the question. It's not just a yes or no question. It really depends on what you're wanting to do. And so that's what I have for you today. So until next time, stay nourished and stay well.